Well, thank you so much, Dr. Rayner, for agreeing to meet with us and to share what you've learned.
Okay.
Appreciate that a lot. So,
now you want me to look into the camera when I talk, or to look at you?
I want you to do what's most comfortable to you.
Okay.
In terms of, if you can look into the camera and you can speak to that and that feels comfortable and fine, that's fine. If not, the camera's close enough that it'll still be a good experience for, the people that are watching this thing. And it's more important that you engage in a way that flows really well for who you are. So if that's better in dialogue, whatever works for you.
I've got a really good cross angle too with you looking at him.
Yeah.
Okay. So it does. So the answer to the question was it doesn't matter, right?
Yeah,
I can sometimes look there and I can sometimes look there.
Yeah, exactly. You can move around like that. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So what I'd like to know is, like, how did you come into this? I mean, how did you come to be in this position of studying what's going on with eye movements and how it relates to reading, and what brought you to this?
Well, a long time ago when I was looking for graduate schools, it was back in the days where most of the research was done in social psychology or animal research in psychology, and I saw an advertisement for a program at Cornell University where there's a light bulb and a little kid looking at the light bulb, and it said to study what people really do. And sort of caught my attention, and I ended up going to Cornell University, and then while there got interested in reading and the question of how can you figure out what people are doing on a moment-to-moment basis when they read. And eye movement seemed like a good way to get at that. And so George McConkie and I developed some techniques a long time ago to try and answer some questions that I think were probably not answerable prior to that. And that's sort of where it started, and then I've just continued. After I was at Cornell, I went to the University of Rochester, and then I came here, and we've had the Eyetracking lab in existence all that time, and been doing lots of research on the questions.
And moments to moments have now become microseconds.
That's right. Milliseconds, exactly.
Milliseconds.
Right.
So what drew your initial interest into reading?
I think there wasn't a lot of, at Cornell there was a program called Project Literacy where there was a lot of money given to try and, this is with Eleanor Gibson, who was a famous developmental psychologist, and there was that project going on, and I don't know, it just seemed to me like reading is sort of a natural way to try and understand how people are learning things and how they're processing information in a useful way. And
so it was a portal to peer in on certain core processes.
Yes, exactly.
And so, as you started to track eyes and see the correspondence between eye movements, and at this time initially tell me about the experiment. Tell me about the initial experiment that you did that kind of brought you to some sense of connection between what's on the page, what somebody's eyes are doing, and what word stream is happening in their mind or voice.
Okay, well, let me just step back a bit. I mean, there was a lot of research that was done on eye movements between, well, I'll back up even more. There's sort of been 3 or 4 periods of research on eye movements. So there was some initial work that was done in the late 1800s where people back then using very crude apparatus discovered many of the basic facts that we know about eye movements when people read. They did strange things like put plaster of Paris cup on the eye, molded it to the eye with an opening in it, and then they had a rod coming out like this, and it was attached to a pen that they ran paper under. And they learned a lot with crude apparatus. Then they eventually went to photographic images, but that was very laborious, where you had to frame by frame look at each frame every 32 milliseconds or something like that and figure out where the eyes were. But then research on using eye movements to infer something about mental processes sort of stopped during the behaviorist era in American psychology. Although there was a lot of research during that period where people learned a lot of descriptive things about eye movements, but they didn't try and infer what's going on in the mind. And in 1959, Miles Tinker wrote the last of a number of reviews that he had in Psychological Bulletin, where he basically concluded that everything we can learn about reading by studying eye movements has been learned. Okay, he was very wrong about that, and he was wrong for a couple of reasons. He couldn't anticipate the technological developments that were going to come along that would make it possible, as we are able to do now, to monitor the eye every millisecond and then have the computer score for us where the eyes are. So you don't have to do the hand scoring that you used to have to do. And the other thing he didn't anticipate was the advances that were going to take place within the field of understanding language from linguistics. And we have a better description of language now than we had in the late 50s when he wrote that article. So the question that we were interested in back in the early 70s was, how much do you see in an eye fixation that you can process and use? And that was sort of the motivating question that got me started in the field. I was working with George McConkey at Cornell, and he had a sabbatical, and we went to MIT to do some experiments there using an eye tracker that they had available, which turned out to not be very reliable, and we had to buy something else and use it. But basically what we did was set up a program of research where we were monitoring eye position and changing things in the display as people are reading to try and determine how much you're seeing. So when we go downstairs, I'll show you a moving window experiment, for example, where there's a page of text on the screen, but you only get to see a certain amount of the text around your fixation point. Wherever your eye goes, the window goes. So the idea is if you make the window very small, this will disrupt reading. And we're looking for how big do you have to make the window so that people read normally. Okay, so this is called the moving window paradigm. And we did a number of experiments using that paradigm, and many more have been done since then. And now they're done in various languages: Hebrew, German, French, Chinese, Japanese. And there are interesting differences that you find as a function of the orthography. And the other technique I developed was called the boundary technique. So here people read, and there's a passage, and there's a word in the passage. And before your eye gets to the word, one word is there. But as your eye approaches it, the computer changes the word that's there and replaces it with another one, right? And so the idea is, if people were picking up information about that word before they got there, and now we change it, and they knew something about that word when they were looking further back, that should disrupt them. And so we look at what kinds of things disrupt them, what kind of changes help them, and so forth. So trying to find out what kind of information you combine across eye movements. That was how it all started. Since then, we've continued doing that research, and also expanded out to do a lot of research on how people deal with ambiguities in language, lexical and phonological and syntactic ambiguities. And we've also developed a computer model which basically called the Easy Reader, which basically simulates what people do when they read and does a very good job of predicting where people will fixate in text and how long they will look there. Was that too long of an answer?
No, that's perfect. There's a lot of great jewels in that. Thank you. You were talking about the guy in the 50s. I had the image of Lord Kelvin in the 1890s saying
Right.
Physics is done.
Right, yeah.
The same kind of arrogant...
Yeah.
So one of the things you just mentioned that intrigued me was the notion that the variation in window in relation to orthography.
Yes.
Yeah. So
Most people find that pretty interesting.
yeah.
So languages differ a lot. A language like English is an alphabetic language where there's a correspondence between the letters and the sounds. In English it isn't perfect. In Spanish it's pretty good. The correspondence between the graphemes and the phonemes is pretty close. It's near perfect. Then there are other languages like Hebrew, where Hebrew is a more densely packed language than English. The function word, well, first of all, for skilled readers of Hebrew, the vowels are systematically deleted from the orthography, and function words are added as clitics to the ends of words. So if it takes you 40 letters to write a sentence in English, it might take 28 in Hebrew because it's more densely packed. And then you have writing systems like Chinese and Japanese that are, well, Chinese is sort of it is a logographic writing system where characters represent morphemes, and so most words in Chinese are 1, 2, or 3 characters, most of them 2 characters. So in Chinese, the information is even more densely packed. And so what you find is this interesting effect that the perceptual span, as we call it, that is the amount of information in an eye fixation that you can use, varies as a function of the orthography. So for English, we find that this perceptual span, span of attention, span of effective vision, whatever you want to call it, extends from about 3 or 4 characters to the left of the eye's location to about 14 or 15 characters to the right. And that's pretty much true for language, for Dutch and German and French. They've all been tested using these techniques that we developed, and you get the same kind of results with those languages. Now Hebrew, of course, you read from right to left. As I said, it's more densely packed, and what you find there is that the span extends about 3 letters to the right of fixation to about 11 to the left. Okay? So the amount of useful information you're picking up in Hebrew is smaller because the information is more densely packed. Now if we go to Chinese, which is even more densely packed, what you find is the span from which you're getting useful information extends about 1 character to the left and about 3 to the right. So Chinese is extremely dense. But if you then figure out how long it's taking people to read as a function of the idea units or the words that are there, then it turns out to be about the same. Span small.
Information density per fixation.
Sorry, is that?
In terms of information density per fixation, you're saying that they're relatively similar, that the window is expanding or contracting? So
the window
the
is
net result in terms of the meat that's being processed per fixation is somewhat more similar?
Yes. So that what's happening is that in terms of the orthography, Chinese is densely packed. You're getting a smaller amount of information, it would seem. You might think, well, okay, that means they must read slower. But no, if you translate what they're processing into word units or into idea units, then it turns out that the reading rates are about the same for the Chinese and the English readers, even though the span of perception, what you're taking in on a fixation and using, is much smaller for the Chinese readers.
Then because on the one hand this is a visual thing, but on the other hand it would seem to imply, and I'm just taking off with what where I'm led from what you're saying, is that this span is somehow a reflection in some way of the processing buffer on the inside.
That's right. Yeah, it's not anything that's hardwired. If it were hardwired, it presumably be similar for everyone and across orthographies. But it's attention based. We know that because it's asymmetric to the right when you're reading English. It's asymmetric to the left when you read Hebrew, and it's being driven by the amount of information that you can use during that single fixation.
Which is like how many placeholders are there in the mind for shuttling fundamental units of distinct meaning? Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
You said Hebrew had the vowels systematically deleted.
Yes.
For whatever it's worth, my understanding is that the vowels were intentionally never put in from the earliest form of the alphabet in the pre-Semitic script because it was taboo to represent the breath.
Really?
There's a deep structure from the very beginning. The original alphabet didn't have any vowels until it was brought to the Greeks, and the Greeks put the vowels into it, saying, "What is this ambiguity here? We got to fill that up and make it more defined." And so that the Hebrews thought that no, that's the sound of the breath. That's the sacred wind. We don't represent that.
Okay.
We represent these consonants that they blow through, but not those things.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure that children have the vowels there when they start out reading. It says when they get older, then they start taking them out.
So that may be a modern adaptation with the kind of training wheels effect to teach the reading.
Right.
Yeah, which is very interesting.
Right.
So one of the other things that your work shines a particularly interesting light on for the things that we're interested in is the timing. In that, I mean, from the time our eyes scan these letters, there's a minimum, there's a window, a critical window of time that those things have to be processed into this net result, virtually heard or actually spoken stream. And if that doesn't all assemble and happen fast enough, then there's this stuttering of mind that starts to set in. So what can we say about the timing or the rate of transfer between these visual pickups and movement of the fixation, and how that translates into phonemes heard or internally or spoken?
Okay, a couple of things. So in silent reading, you typically move your eyes about every 250 milliseconds. Okay, that's about the average fixation time of the eye. But there's a lot of variability around that. Sometimes it's as short as 100 milliseconds. Sometimes it can be as long as 500 milliseconds. And the variability is being largely driven by things related to how easy or difficult it is to process the word that you're looking at. So a word that's hard to look at, a very low frequency, unfamiliar word, the eyes will systematically remain on that word longer, will also more likely make a second fixation on the word before moving on. Whereas a very high frequency familiar word, you may only need one relatively shorter fixation. Like I said, the average is around 250, but there's lots of variability. It's being, how long the eyes are there, being driven by the difficulty of encoding the information. In oral reading, the eyes tend to fixate a bit longer, but there are places where the eye sort of pauses to not get too far ahead of the voice, right? In silent reading, you lost my train of thought. You'll edit this all out, I'm sure, right?
Of course, no, it's no concern.
Let's see, what was I? Where did I want to go there?
Making a distinction between oral and oral externalized speech and internalized in the speed at which we're doing these fixations and the duration of fixation.
Right. Okay. Let me go back to that. In silent reading, the average fixation duration is around 250 milliseconds. There's time that's involved in moving the eyes from one place to another, so that the latency, just the simple motor reaction time of the eye, is about 150 milliseconds at least. So there's not a lot of time in there to process the information that you're looking at, yet it's still interesting that, as I said, the eyes are being influenced by how hard or easy the word is to process.
Is it just the word, or what about the conceptual density of the whole thing? Isn't there also a pause and reflection that's also, or have you filtered that out somehow experimentally?
Most of the time it appears that the eyes are being driven largely by lexical processing of the words, so that when there's higher order comprehension issues that are coming in, there will be times when the eyes will slow down for that. But for the most part, the eyes are being driven by how easy or hard the word is. You have, as I said, a very short period of time, because there's time involved with programming the eye movement, but it seems that there's a lot of parallel processing going on too. For one thing, before you get to a word, you've done some processing of what that word is that helps you identify the word when you then move to it. And one interesting thing we've found is that phonological codes about the word that's coming up are used. So you get information about the orthographic codes of the upcoming word, but also some phonological information is coming in. So you've got a preview of a word before you get there. Then you're processing the word to get the meaning. You're probably, well, you are hearing your voice as you read. Most people experience that. And so there's a tight link between, when you read silently, between what the eyes are looking at and what you're hearing in your head, which is a bit different than when you read aloud, where the eye is ahead of the voice, but the eye doesn't want to get too far ahead. Did I answer what you wanted there?
Yeah, that was good. That's good. What does this... we talked on the phone about this briefly, and we were talking about the difference between a good reader and a struggling reader could be distilled down using the inferences from this to be in the 25, 50 millisecond kind of threshold.
Differences between what people are doing in an eye fixation?
Yeah, well, no, people that are able to just read along fluently. The orthography and the word recognition, all this is transparent, it's flowing. And people that are struggling, that the difference between them can actually show up in the time it's taking them to process,
right?
Which can be inferred, that difference, by the eye movement tracking to a degree.
Poorer readers will have longer fixations typically. They also probably, we have some recent data which suggests to us that the less efficient readers rely too heavily on context. The better readers, their eye fixations are being more influenced by the frequencies of the words that they're looking at, whereas the less skilled readers are being more influenced by what the contextual information is. And sometimes if the contextual information were always perfect and always told you for sure or helped you know what was coming next, that would be one thing. But in reality, a lot of text isn't totally redundant, and so you can't always, it's not always what you think it's going to be, and so sometimes they go wrong because of that. They may also make inappropriate inferences, and a lot of this kind of thing will be reflected in their eye movements. We can, set up experiments where we try and figure out what kind of inferences people are making, how are they processing these words, and then look and see what kind of differences emerge between the skilled and less skilled readers, and reliable differences do show up.
Can you see the letter, letter sound or the phoneme grapheme processing? Can you infer about that? I mean, we talked about orthographic ambiguity, or the letter sound confusions between these, and how that affects. One of the interview tracks we've been on has to do with fuzzy sound boundaries in developing oral language facility, and how that can create a processing lag time or a lack of sufficient distinction to build on later. And then another problem that struggling readers seem to have is actually getting the right letter sound combinations to work. And when we talked last, one of the things that there was an average, I think you were saying it was 25 milliseconds or so on average that letters and sounds have to line up in.
I don't remember saying that.
Okay.
What I can say about phonological thing again is, so we've done some experiments where we have people read, and before you get to a word, there could be a homophone of the word there. Let's say the word that you want to be there is a sentence about a sandy beach. Before you get to the word beach, it could be the correct word, or it could be the homophone, B-E-E-C-H, or it could be an orthographic control word like bench, B-E-N-C-H. That looks as much like beach, B-E-A-C-H, as the homophone does. Or it could just be some unrelated word like house. And what we find is that skilled readers get lots of preview benefit from the homophone. They get about 20 milliseconds benefit above and beyond having bench there. So bench helps you. It looks an awful lot like beach. It's just that the homophone helps you about 20 or 25 milliseconds more for skilled readers. For the less skilled readers, we don't get that effect. There's no differentiation for them between the orthographic control, that is bench, and the homophone. So they get a little bit of preview benefit from both of them, but the really skilled readers are getting benefit from the homophone, suggesting that they're getting phonological codes prior to getting to that word. And it's all happening within a very short time. Like I said, it's about a 20-25 millisecond effect. Is that what I was
Yeah, so I think that's where we were going. Is
Okay.
that one thing I'm trying to say is that we're talking about processing this code at a pretty good clip, faster than we can think about, unconscious, all automatic, and on average, so many milliseconds per letter into sound, or the thing doesn't work.
That's right. It's all happening very fast at an unconscious level. In fact, when you stop and try thinking about what your eyes are doing, you quickly become aware that you're not reading the same way you normally do. So if you start thinking, where am I looking now? What am I processing? Then reading sort of breaks down. It's an automatic process that we've learned during the process of reading to quickly abstract the information that we want, convert it into a phonological code, and get to the meaning of the words that we're looking at, right?
So what you just said was really exciting to me, and a little blip of energy, which has to do with when I think about it, I change it.
Yeah.
As if, in addition to, in other words, there's only so much bandwidth.
Mm-hmm.
There's only so much processing bandwidth. If we, in addition to this challenging task, at least in the early stages of learning it, if I'm overconscious about it in some way, that's dissipating the energy that's necessary to do it.
Right. That even is true for skilled readers. I mean, so even skilled readers, when you stop and think about what you're doing and try and analyze as you're going along, where are my eyes, what am I processing, how much am I getting now, it all breaks down. So it's all happening very fast, very much at an unconscious, automatic level.
And it needs to.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Right. That if we're too conscious in the mechanics, it won't assemble fast enough for it to work.
Right. Yeah.
This is one of the real missing pieces of general understanding, it seems, is that if the moment we start to become over self-conscious of the process, it's not only doesn't feel good, It's dissipating the processing resources necessary to do the job.
Right. It is interesting. I mean, it goes both ways. You can read and move your eyes rather normally. Oh, sorry, you can move your eyes rather normally, but sort of go into a zone out mode where you're not, where you've read a couple of lines and all of a sudden realize, I didn't understand anything that I just read. And if you go back and look at the eye movements, they're somewhat similar still to when you're normally reading and understanding. So it's possible to go into these zone out things where the eyes still keep going. So that automatic process keeps on going, but the link to getting the comprehension is gone. And then on the other end, if there's comprehension problems and you start really slowing down and trying to figure out what's going on here, then the other system doesn't work as well.
Yeah, this is so vital on so many levels, this point.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that we're really particularly concerned with is what we call the downward spiral of shame.
Mm-hmm.
What happens when, the more children or adults feel, the general thing is this is artificially confusing. Mm-hmm. This is a form of confusion that's not natural to the way the organism evolved to deal with confusions.
Right.
And the context is such that most of the people, at least here in this country, that have difficulty with this, feel as if the difficulty or the confusion is a reflection of something wrong with them. Mm-hmm. This leads to shame. Mm-hmm. The shame stories that we've collected are just unbelievable. And what that means, if we come at it from an affect science point of view, is that there's this trigger into shame, which leads to self-consciousness, which leads to the dissipation of the energy to do the job. And it's a downward spiral. It's kind of like Stannovich's Matthew effects.
Yeah, I was just going to say that. I mean, the sad thing is, you would like to think that with time, differences in reading skill would get smaller as people had more experience with reading. But in fact, as Stennett has demonstrated, that's not what happens. The differences get bigger between those who can do it well and those who can't as they move from the lower grades up into the upper grades.
Yeah, arguably to do with the plasticity of the reflexes that formed in the infrastructure of processing, and also this shame, this how we feel about ourselves, or becoming conscious that we actually have a feeling about it, is dissipated for the very reasons you were just describing. And I think that was a really important point. Thank you. A good reader and a bad reader. What could you say about the difference in how fast they're processing? That's the line between them, if you can.
It's hard to answer that for sure. What I can tell you is that very systematically you will get differences between a skilled and a less skilled reader in their eye movement indices. So the skilled readers are going to move their eyes further on each saccade or movement of the eye. They're going to have their fixations be shorter systematically than the less skilled readers. And probably the biggest difference is the skilled readers are only going to look back about 5 to 10% of the time, whereas the less skilled readers are going to look back more. Those are called regressions, where you have to go back because something hasn't computed. And the less skilled readers will do that much more frequently than the skilled readers. So
regression, might say, is connected to a dropout in comprehension.
Yeah, there's actually two reasons for regressions. One is that it's an ocular motor thing where you sometimes send your eyes a bit too far and then you make an adjustment and come back. And surprisingly, about 80% of the 90% of the regressions that people make are very short. They're either within the word or back one word. So those are probably not being driven by higher level comprehension. They're either being driven by ocular motor things where you overshot the word where you want it to be, or perhaps you didn't quite complete the processing of the prior word and you realize that and you have to go back and look at it again.
So you're leaving that word and something doesn't seem right about it. So you're cycling back to that word where you just were, that last point.
Yes, exactly. So then that leaves about 10% of the regressions, which are what I would consider to be comprehension failures. This is when you're just sort of reading easy text. Now, if you go to harder text, then you'll get a lot more regressions. But again, no matter what the kind of text is, you will systematically get these differences between the skilled and less skilled, between skilled and less skilled readers, where the less skilled readers are going to systematically look back more often, which probably means that they aren't getting it as well. And so, there used to be some people who would argue that eye movements cause reading problems, and there are people who do a lot of corrective techniques with eye movement exercises. Now, There certainly are some people who have faulty eye movements who need help with that kind of thing. But for the most part, I think what eye movements are doing is reflecting the moment-to-moment processing that people are engaging in. And when they're having a problem, they have to look back. And so the eye movements are reflecting problems rather than causing
They're
problems.
following the meaning tracking processing that's going on as a
Exactly.
whole rather than leading it.
Yes,
Yeah,
right.
yeah. Yeah, I actually know of, there's so many people that if you only did this, it'll solve the reading problem. And it goes from hemispheric balancing and, this kind of stuff to wearing glasses that will change the optical center of the way your eye is relative to the center line of your nose.
Right.
So there's just...
There's probably a little bit of validity in most of those things, but the problem that most of them have is they all say this is the cause of the reading problem, and there's no one single cause of reading problems. There's many, many reasons why people have difficulty with this very complex task.
Yeah, it is a complex task with multiple variants involved, and weaknesses in any one of the variants can cause a collapse in the house of cards of the whole, and to think,
Yeah.
And there's so much study that's happening on the 3 to 5% that we can't reach at the bottom, as if that's a general example for everybody. It includes the 88% of black fourth grade children that are below proficient. I mean, that's such a huge scale that has so many variables in it.
Right.
So back to timing, what could you say inside of what you just did about noticing that there's a difference in the duration of a fixation, there's a difference in the number of fixations and some unit time that you're measuring. So there is some inferences about processing efficiency, processing frequency, processing ecology, and these movements of eye.
Right.
So there's some minimum threshold that you've identified that if they're doing it this frequently, then they're reading really more transparently or more effectively, and if they're below a certain level of bouncing around either in duration or frequency, I mean, is there some threshold that you can speak to that? What I'm trying to do is just help people understand this thing is time critical, that there isn't, just like we were saying, if the brain's thinking about, if I'm thinking about what I'm doing, well, that helps, that slows things down, that burns things up. If it takes too long to get through this, it's just not going to all work, and that's implicitly inferred in some of what you're doing. I want to get that as explicitly crisp as I can.
Well, unfortunately, I can't say a lot about differences between skilled and less skilled readers on those time dimensions. I mean, what we have been working on, as I said, is a model where we try and simulate, well, we don't try, we do simulate where people will look in text and how long they will look there. And in order to do that, we have to specify in the computer program that we write that does this various timing dimensions. And there are generally distributions that we use around a mean, but people are probably, they need to access the meanings of the words that they're looking at within 150 milliseconds or so. They're getting some preview before they get there that's helping them, and so there are some timing issues that are very important in terms of specifying where people are going to go and how long they're going to look there, but we haven't really yet figured out what kind of differences there might be
or
in
the
individuals.
granularity of letters and sounds. I mean, when you said a word in 150 milliseconds, depending on what we say, 7 letters, 5 letters, now we're talking 25 milliseconds or so that on average this collection of letters has to generate a sound signature that's recognized as a word.
Right. I suspect that most letters that are in your sort of foveal zone, or the area right around your fixation, are probably being processed pretty much in parallel, so I don't think we need to think of them as one 25 milliseconds, another 25 milliseconds, but averaged over them, it's going to be about 25 milliseconds,
Okay, so on average, again, I agree with you. We're not talking, that's just to break it down so we can talk about it, but that there's an all-at-once processing that's nonetheless considering these discrete elements and part of the pattern recognition of the all-at-once and the fixation, and that if we looked at the number of letters and sounds they're creating, it's approximately 25 milliseconds or so letter to sound conversion rate. That's in groups.
Yeah,
Like
right, yeah. Okay. Very fast, staggeringly fast.
Yeah, I think that's, in terms of artificial activity, that we're engaging in. I mean, it's incredibly fast that a 5 or 6 year old is going from this world of, I mean, there's somatic activities that is fast, for sure, but an artificial, symbolic information processing task that's moving at that fast, there's no precedent for it.
Right. Of course, again, 5 and 6 year olds aren't going that fast. I mean, so beginning reading is laborious and slow, and so if we look at the eye fixations of a first grader, they're going to be close to double what they are for skilled readers. The distance they move their eyes is going to be about a half to a third of what skilled readers move, and they'll regress more too. And so you can see in developmental characteristics of the eye movements over time, by about 4th or 5th grade, the eye movement indices have stabilized out. And so a 4th or 5th grader looks very much like an adult reader. And they may make a few more regressions, but they generally look like an adult reader as long as you give them text that's appropriate for them. If you give the hard text, then it all breaks down. But for children at the end of first grade, the average fixation times are going to be up around 400 or 500 milliseconds, and they're going to move their eyes about 3 letters. So it's, they're learning how to get the information in, how to coordinate this very complicated system of the processing of identifying words and moving their eyes and so forth.
But I understand clearly that when they first take off, they're not moving at this kind of speed. But they're heading in a trajectory of learning to process at this kind of speed. And
exactly.
If they're not doing it fast enough, early enough, then we're heading in this downward direction we talked about.
Yeah, exactly.
And so in that sense, it's this unnaturally fast, precarious timing processing challenge.
Yeah, you said some interesting things about children when they come to learn to read, and there are a lot of things that they have to master that they haven't done before, and one of them is coordinating the eyes. I mean, they look at television and they look at their world around them, but they haven't actually had to focus their attention so precisely as they have to when they start reading. So that's another skill that they have to develop.
Any natural thing that you're aware of that's close to that? I mean, that requires the same kind of mechanistic control of the movement and focus of the eyes?
It's not obvious. I mean, they spend a lot of time looking at television probably, but they're probably not doing the same kind of things that they're doing in reading, where, we're talking about moving your eyes about 3 characters, which is about 1 degree of visual angle, when most of the eye movements they're making before that are much bigger. Yeah.
So, thank you. All this is great. Is there any particular finding that thumped you? Like, wow, it wasn't expected for you in your process of discovery and learning with this?
There have been a couple along the way. I think the one thing that surprised me early on was I thought that people would be overlapping visual images from fixation to fixation. So I thought that you would be getting visual information from the word that's coming up next and overlapping that with the information when your eyes get there. We did these interesting experiments where we changed the case of the word during the saccade, and it had very little effect. People didn't even know it was happening for the most part. And so what that is saying is that it's sort of more abstract codes about the letters, and these abstract codes are being turned into phonological codes. My intuition early on would have been, well, you're just overlapping these visual images. You store an image of the word that's coming up, and then you overlap the new image that you're looking at, and that's what speeds you up. But it's not visual overlap that's important.
It's implicit code.
Yes, exactly. Right.
So it's the implicit meaning form, whatever you might say, a phoneme of meaning, that's being processed, not some residual ghost visual image like you. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
I suspect that people found our initial findings of what the size of the span of perception was interesting. But that sort of, those studies, the initial studies, are sort of considered landmark studies, and like I said, lots of people have replicated those things. I thought maybe the span would be larger than it was.
The span in terms of duration of fixation, or
in terms of what you see. I mean, your impression.
Okay, the size of the window.
Yes. Phenomenologically, it feels like you can see everything, right? You can see out to the ends of the lines. But maybe you can see that, but you're not using it.
But isn't that kind of like micro focus? I mean, I can see that there's something hanging on the wall over here, but I'm not paying attention to it.
Yeah.
I'm paying attention to your eyes. I'm paying attention to other things as I'm cueing in with you, and that this other stuff that's in the peripheral vision is this contextual field whose meaning comes only when I'm really paying attention to it.
Yeah.
And so what you're saying is that there was a thought that there would be more distribution of richness of information in the size of that window than...
Even now I give talks to people who are not psychologists, so I give it to, in other areas, and usually what I find is people saying to me in the question and answer period, well, surely I can see way out further than what you're saying. You're saying 15 characters away from where you're currently fixated. I feel like I can see a lot more out there. Yeah, you feel like that, but that's not the reality. That's not what you're really processing.
Yeah, so again, that's this kind of a glow of the field that I'm aware of, but in terms of where this implicit code processing focal plane is in attention, it's this...
Right. Another interesting thing that we did find was that you don't get information below the line you're reading. So sometimes people have the feeling that they are getting all sorts of meaning stuff below that's coming up. No. I think when you're reading, what you're doing is really focusing your attention on the line that you're looking at, and information below is getting filtered out. It's interesting. We have found a couple of dyslexic readers who read better with our moving windows, and when the windows are very small. And I think that we've written up these papers, and I think that what it suggests is that there are some people who can't focus their attention, and so when there's other things out there, I think what skilled readers are doing are focusing their attention within what they're processing and not letting lots of the other stuff get in their way. And there are a couple of people out there that have problems with that.
So you're giving them a mask.
Yeah, we're so there's one subject dyslexic reader, very smart guy, who loved reading in our lab where we only let him see the word that he was looking at and the next word. He just loved that bit. And then when you made the window larger, for everybody else, what we find is when you make the window larger and you get it out to about 15 characters, they're reading maximally. But for him, as we expanded the window, his reading performance went down because he couldn't, you're processing probably the meaning of the word that you're looking at. If there's two short words together, you process the both of them at the same time and skip over the second one. And you're getting some more gross information about the upcoming words that you're then using to guide your eye as to where to go to. But he's not able to filter all of this stuff out, and so it's interfering with him. And so he'd like better to read with very small windows.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. We talked to a couple of struggling young adults. Just touching stories of agony and pain. And they talk about the dancing letters. They're just moving all over the place. There's this swirling kind of confusion. And that what they do, one of their strategies, of course, is to bring up a piece of paper right underneath the line to block off all that noise.
That's what we told this guy to do. We, in fact, made an index card and put a hole in it and had him read by moving the index card across. And that helped. That helped, but didn't like it as well as being in our lab, because that takes time to move the card, and so the reading's going slowly. In our lab, the window's being controlled by the eyes, and the eye movement reaction time is, like I said, about 150 milliseconds, so it was much faster and more natural.
The window can keep up with whatever's optimal for his rate of tracking,
exactly,
rather than having to have the extra dissipation of the brain's involvement in moving the window.
Yes, right.
Yeah. That's excellent. Interesting. I think your work is fantastic. What else? What is the juicy news? What else have you discovered?
I went to China recently and spent some time there. There was a fellow who came over as a visitor here for a year, and I went over there, and so we've started doing some research with Chinese, which is pretty fascinating. Lots of people have made lots of claims about Chinese being different, that readers of Chinese don't hear the inner voice when they read, that it's all a direct processing. I think that's largely not true, that Chinese readers, like English readers, hear their voice. Maybe some of them claim, if I teach a class and I ask the undergraduates, how many of you hear your voice as you read? 99% of them say yes. Every now and then there's one that claims not to, although I'm not convinced about that.
Vinesky would be the one holding his hand up there.
Is that right? Okay.
Well, it would have been, yeah.
If you go to a class in Chinese, in China, there might be a higher percentage of them that say they don't hear the voice, but still, most of the evidence suggests that phonological codes for them are just as important as they are for us. And so we've started doing some research with Chinese readers to try and see what kind of differences, what kind of similarities there are. And I must say that so far, mainly what we're finding is many more similarities than differences. I mean, yes, they move their eyes a shorter distance, their fixations are a little bit longer and so forth, but they, word frequency, character frequency, how predictable the word is, those things all matter to Chinese readers just like they matter to us.
That's in this kind of implicate contextual layering that's going on to get the stream of meaning happening.
Right.
But there's a difference in the assembly, yeah? I mean, when you're looking at the Chinese characters, getting the right particular meaning has to do with the contextual field rather than an assembly from letters and sounds to get to the word recognition, yeah?
Yeah, well, Chinese is really complicated. I mean, you usually have a word is made up of two characters, and there are semantic radicals and phonetic radicals that are giving them clues as to what the precise meaning and sound is of the word. And there's a lot of, as you say, contextual information that's very important. The experiment that we just did recently examined how much contextual constraint influences Chinese readers when they read words. And we compared results that we got with the Chinese readers with English readers, where we had translations of the English sentences in Chinese, and the results were amazingly similar in terms of.
This is with good readers.
This is with good readers.
Okay.
Exactly.
If you got to the point where you're comparing similar passages with beginning or struggling readers.
No, I mean that's clearly an interesting thing to do, and China's interesting because they're just getting started with a lot of this stuff. And
I was over there 2 years ago, and I gave a presentation to the office, which is a government office of linguistics. I was kind of surprised. I met this he's 102 years old. The Professor Higgins of China. Right? He took me into this lab in the back where Thomas Edison had actually made a tool for him. He still had it.
Yeah.
Amazing people. Okay, well that's fantastic. Anything else that you think we should talk about in this space?
Well, I guess one thing that I would say is that 99% of the research that's been done on eye movements is done with skilled readers. And there have been reasons for that. It's largely difficult, it has been, to track the eye movements of children because the apparatus is not designed for maximal use with children. But that's changing now. And so I think that's what we're going to see in the next few years is lots more experiments with children, where I think that we'll probably learn a lot about exactly what's going on from these kind of experiments. I had a paper in 1986 dealing with the perceptual span of children. So I tested kids at the end of first grade, at the end of third grade, and the end of fifth grade. And it was quite a chore to get the data from children. When we go downstairs to the lab, you can see the differences between the kinds of eye trackers. One of them requires a fixed head, and that you need to be very still and not move around. Children don't like that much. And now there are these kind of eye tracking systems where you can put the eye tracker on the child's head and they can move around. We don't like them to move around much, but the system actually tracks the head and the eyes. And so you can compensate for the head movements in this kind of system. So I think we're going to see a lot more research with children, which I think will give us a much better understanding of what they're doing early on.
You need to track the head relative to the eyes in order to have some registration relative to the text. You need to track the head relative to the eye in order to have some kind of put it on a registration grid with where the text is?
Yes, right. With most of the studies that we've done with adults, most of these moving window boundary type of experiments, you don't want the head movement being confounded with the eye movement. So you fix the head, and so the head doesn't move, so it's only the eye that's moving, right? But children don't like to keep their heads still. That's something they're not used to. And so now these newer systems don't necessarily require a fixed head because the eyes are being tracked. At the same time, there's a helmet over their head where they're tracking the head movements as well. And so the computer compensates for the head movements. So you
can envision a time where where a pair of glasses can actually tell where the eyes are moving relative to it, and the glasses can tell where the glasses are relative to the text.
Yeah, well, we're getting closer to that. Yeah.
So at a point where your kids having trouble reading, they put on the glasses and whatever the device is, and It's there to help them for whatever loop that or feedback that part can generate.
Yeah, one of the things we were talking with, you mentioned Marilyn Adams, one of the things we've been talking with Marilyn about is doing experiments in which we're monitoring the eye and having children read aloud and using automatic speech recognition system to give them feedback about where they're going wrong. So, I mean, those kind of things are on the horizon, and they're
Do you get called upon to be a test bed for new innovations and reading techniques? To put them on the grid of how does that relate to their improvements in eye movements?
There are people that have asked, but I've typically tried to avoid that because I want to keep our lab sort of focused mainly on basic research. Yeah, and so yeah, I mean we're very busy. There's 3 eye trackers. We're constantly running experiments, and so to the extent that I would do those kind of things, it would slow up, I think, other activities in the lab. I'm mainly interested in finding out what's going on inside the head as people are reading and understanding text, and so
the implicate order of processing.
Yeah, we've learned a lot, but I think there's still more to learn, and so that's why I like basic research.
Can you see have you ever tried to see affective turbulence in eye movement?
Tell me what you mean by that.
What happens
when they're getting upset because
when they're getting upset? Yeah, what's happening to eye movement when they're coming into or in shame?
No, we haven't. I mean, again, that's probably something that's worth doing, but we haven't gone there yet.
One of the things I'm really interested in is being able to see the facial display. The biggest thing about affect is it's facially displayed. That's the way we evolved. But to see the facial display superimposing on that, eye tracking where information is relative to the text that they're reading, how they're, so you can actually see the effect of affect on cognition and processing.
The technology for doing those kind of things is here now. It's just a matter of coordinating them at all. Yeah.
So if we have, because we have some other people that are interested in that, would that be something that would be interesting to you? Under the right grant conditions?
It would depend.
Under the right grant, enough money does that. Okay,
yeah.
I understand that. But I mean, is it intrinsically interesting?
How are you going to measure the affect in the faces? Are there people who know how to do that?
Yes,
that can reliably say this person is happy now or sad now from the facial expressions.
Oh yeah, yeah. I'm going to do this with MRI in reading. I'm going to do this with eye tracking in reading to show that most people think of this affect or emotional thing as this kind of sideshow, but it's much more fundamental to cognition, and to actually bring that out and show that correlation more strongly.
Yeah, most cognitive psychologists want to filter that out and not have that be a factor, but any realistic
about dissipation,
yeah,
it's got to be accounted for. It's got to be understood.
Right.
I mean, it's a cognitive shock that dissipates processing resources.
Right.
And it's fundamentally interesting in that sense.
I think it would be quite possible for experiments to be done where you record people's eye movements while they're looking at something, and also get a picture of their face. And if you could reliably tell from the facial expression where they are, then you could then coordinate the eye movements or the brain imaging or whatever you're doing. That would be interesting.
Yeah, that's what we've envisioned as a future setup and we're working towards. Good. Well, I think I'm pretty happy at this point. I'd like to go down and see the tracker in motion.
Okay.
But I want to make sure that we haven't left anything unsaid that you think is important in this space.
Can't think of anything right now.
It's so rich what you're doing.
Can't think of anything. I think I've covered most of it. So,
Cori, any questions that occur to you? Excellent. Okay, then let's wrap here.
Okay.
It's time to cough again.